Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something really fundamental to learning. It seems simple, maybe, just talking in a classroom,
Mm.
but it's actually, well, surprisingly complex,
Mm.
especially in language classes, where the language is both the tool and the goal.
Right, exactly.
The conversations there, they're not just chatter, they're more like the actual architecture of how learning gets built, moment by moment.
And yeah, guiding us through this sort of hidden architecture today is a stack of sources mainly based around a chapter. It's called Classroom Talk, Interaction, and Collaboration by Steve Walsh and Lai.
Okay.
So our mission, really, for this deep dive is to unpack how all that stuff talk, interaction, collaboration, how it actually works inside a language classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, why understanding these dynamics is just essential if you want to create or, maximize learning opportunities.
Right.
Whether you're teaching or learning yourself or maybe just curious about education. This is about seeing what's really going on beneath the surface chat.
Okay, let's dive in. You mentioned this hidden architecture. Why focus so much on classroom conversation? I mean, it seems, well, obvious that people talk in class, doesn't it?
It does seem obvious, yeah. But the source really stresses just how complex it is. Walsh, he describes classroom interaction as happening in these highly complex, fast-paced, multi-party social contexts.
Wow, okay. Fast-paced multi-party.
Yeah, think about it. You've got multiple people, turns happening really quickly. Everyone might have slightly different goals. It's actually quite hard to fully grasp it all in the moment because the talk itself is doing so many jobs at once. Checking understanding, offering help, modeling language, managing the group.
So it's like juggling like a dozen balls at once, in public, at speed.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
And as the source points out, drawing on Long's work from way back in '83, this juggling act, it's especially critical in a language class.
Why specifically?
Because the language is the subject. It's the vehicle and object of instruction. You're literally using the language to learn the language.
Okay, that distinction feels important. It's not just like using English to talk about chemistry. You're using English to learn the nuts and bolts of English.
Precisely. And the core argument the source is present is that language learning doesn't just happen from interaction, like, getting input from hearing people talk.
Right.
It happens in interaction. As Ellis put it back in 2000, learning arises not through interaction, but in interaction.
In interaction. Huh. And that feels like more than just a word choice thing. It's saying the process itself is where the learning happens.
That's it, exactly. The negotiation, the struggle sometimes, the way meaning gets built together in that moment of interaction, that's fundamentally where the learning is located.
Okay.
And this whole perspective, it's rooted in sociocultural ideas, people like Vygotsky,
Yeah.
who saw language as this vital tool for mediating thought.
Uh-huh.
That's why someone like Van Leer called interaction the most important element in the curriculum back in '96.
Wow. So it's not just about the teacher's like perfectly planned lesson then. It's about what actually happens when that plan hits the messy reality of people talking to each other.
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes this. Effective teaching isn't just about planning. It's about the interactive decisions teachers make, constantly, moment by moment.
Right.
And Walsh's work shows how those split-second choices, like who gets to talk, when they talk, how you deal with mistakes, those things can massively open up or restrict the chances for learning.
So understanding these dynamics gives teachers the tools to make better choices in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. Insight to make those right choices, yeah.
Okay, but it sounds incredibly complex and fast. If this interaction is so vital, but also so hard to like pin down, how do researchers or even teachers, how do they get a handle on what's actually going on?
Yeah, that is the big challenge. And the source points to the need for teachers to really engage in data-led, evidence-based reflection, looking at their own practice. Mann and Walsh talk about this.
Okay, data in a classroom.
Yeah.
Does that just mean like test scores or?
Well, scores can be part of it, sure.
Yeah.
But not just scores. It could be looking at materials, yeah. But a really powerful kind of data is the interaction itself, the actual talk.
Yeah, okay.
By studying recordings, maybe, or transcripts of their own lessons, teachers can develop something the source calls classroom interactional competence. CIC.
CIC.
Yeah, it's about building this really nuanced understanding of how talk is shaping learning opportunities right there in their specific classroom.
Okay, CIC. Understanding your own interactional habits and their effects. I can definitely see how that would be crucial.
It really is. But one challenge the source brings up is that there isn't really a widely shared, detailed language for teachers to describe interaction effectively.
What do you mean?
Well, we often fall back on really broad labels, right? Like teacher-centered
Yeah.
or lots of student talk.
Yeah.
But we need a richer way to talk about the specifics, the nitty-gritty, a kind of meta language.
Yeah, I see.
And that's why studying interactions using, more qualitative approaches is so valuable, capturing the detail. People have been recording classroom talks since the 60s, actually, trying to get at this level.
That makes total sense. You need the right words to describe the architecture if you're going to understand it, or maybe change it. So what are some of the key bits of this hidden architecture? What have researchers found when they look really closely?
Great question. Yeah, when you really analyze classroom talk, certain things tend to stand out. Features that often make it different from, say, just chatting with friends.
Okay.
One really big one is control. Unlike that chat with friends, classrooms have these built-in asymmetrical roles. Teacher, learners.
Right.
A bit like maybe a doctor-patient dynamic. One person usually has more power to steer the conversation. Breen calls it the teacher orchestrating the interaction.
Orchestrating, yeah.
And this control directly affects what Walsh and Lee call the space for learning.
Space for learning. I like that term.
Yeah, it's useful. Teachers can consciously open up that space, ask more open-ended questions, perhaps, or avoid repeating every single student answer that's called teacher echo.
Oh, right.
Or even just increasing wait time, waiting a bit longer after asking a question before jumping in or calling on someone. Little things that create room.
So the teacher can either, make room for students to step in or sort of keep the spotlight on themselves.
Exactly. Then another classic feature, maybe the most famous pattern, is the IRF or IRE exchange.
Ah, yes.
I think I know this one.
Probably. Sinclair and Coulthard identified this basic three-part structure. Initiation, usually the teacher asks something. Response, the student answers. And then feedback or evaluation, the teacher reacts.
The classic. Teacher, what's the past tense of go?
Yeah.
Student, went. Teacher, went. Good.
Right. That is the absolute quintessential example, yes. And a direct result is, teachers often end up doing most of the talking. They control the turns, they control the evaluation.
Now, there's a bit of debate about the IRF. Some argue it really limits student initiative, makes things predictable.
Yeah, I can see that.
But others point out that the third part, the F, move the feedback. That's actually key. If the teacher's feedback prompts more discussion, maybe asks why, or gets other students involved, calls this a spiral IRF.
Spiral.
Yeah, where the feedback opens things up again, rather than just closing the exchange down. So the structure itself isn't necessarily bad. It really depends on how that final move is used.
Okay, so it's not just the pattern, but how you use the pattern. That makes sense. What else?
Okay, a third key thing is speech modification. Teachers, often without even thinking about it, adjust how they talk.
How so?
Well, maybe speaking a bit slower or more clearly, pausing more, using emphasis, simplifying grammar or vocabulary sometimes. It's a bit like caretaker speech, how adults talk to young kids.
Ah, right.
But it's not about dumbing things down. It's strategic. It helps comprehension, especially when there's lots of people talking what Schwab calls multi-log. And it also models the target language clearly.
Okay.
Teachers also use tons of discourse markers. Right, okay, now, so to signal shifts, structure the lesson.
Like signposts.
Exactly like signposts. And they use interactional strategies, too.
Yeah.
Checking understanding. Did you say X? Asking for clarification. Sorry, what was that again? Or just giving those little or yes back channels to show they're listening and keep things flowing.
So it's like this whole toolkit teachers have, maybe subconsciously, just to manage the conversation and make the language easier to access?
That's a great way to put it. A toolkit honed by experience. Fourth feature flowing from that is elicitation techniques, which basically means questioning. Classrooms are just full of questions.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And the source highlights this key difference between display questions and referential questions.
Okay, what's the difference?
A display question is where the teacher already knows the answer. They're checking if the student knows, what's the past tense of go
Right.
example.
Taking facts.
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas a referential question is a genuine question.
Yeah.
The teacher doesn't know the answer and wants the student's actual opinion or information, like, what did you think of that reading? Or what did you do on the weekend?
Ah, okay. So display questions, test knowledge, referential questions get, real thoughts.
Generally, yeah. And referential questions often lead to longer, more complex answers from students. But And this is the really crucial point the source makes. It's not about saying one type is always better than the other.
Oh,
The key is aligning the question type with the pedagogic goal of that specific moment in the lesson.
what do you mean?
Well, if your goal is quick vocabulary recall, a display question is probably the most efficient way to do it. What's this? It's a pen. Done.
Okay.
But if your goal is to get students discussing opinions on a complex topic, you need those referential open-ended questions. So it's not about communicative versus not communicative in a simple way. It's about fitness for purpose. Does the question do the job you need it to do right now?
Ah, okay. That makes way more sense. It's about the intention behind the question, not just the form of the question itself.
Exactly. Shifts the focus to why you're asking.
Yeah.
Fifth feature, repair. Basically, how errors or misunderstandings get dealt with.
Right. The correction stuff.
Yeah. And teachers have this whole range of strategies, don't they? Sometimes they ignore an error. Sometimes they correct it directly. Sometimes they prompt the student nearly to fix it themselves or get a classmate to help out. The source connects these to different types of repair identified in conversation analysis, actually. But again, like with questions, the strategy should ideally match the goal.
How so?
Well, if you're doing focus accuracy practice on, say, past tense endings, you'll probably want to correct errors related to that quite explicitly.
Makes sense.
But if students are involved in a fluency activity, maybe a role play, you might prioritize keeping the communication flowing, as Van Leer suggested. Interrupting every little error could just shut them down.
Yeah, that sounds like a real tension for teachers. Correct everything and kill the flow, or let things slide and maybe bad habits form?
It absolutely is a tension.
Yeah.
Although, the source does note that learners often expect correction in a classroom setting, more than they would in just a casual chat.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the key seems to be being deliberate. Why am I correcting this now? How am I correcting it? Is it serving the immediate learning goal?
Right. Being intentional again?
Always. And finally, the source mentions scaffolding. This is a big concept.
Scaffolding, like building support.
Exactly. It's about the support given by someone more capable, usually the teacher, but could be a peer to help a learner achieve something they couldn't quite manage on their own.
Okay.
It's described as being graduated and contingent, meaning you give just enough help just when it's needed, and then you gradually withdraw it as the learner gets better.
Like giving linguistic props.
That's a perfect way to think of it. Providing temporary props may be a key word, a sentence starter, that help the learner participate and build their skills. It's a really common and generally very helpful feature of language classroom talk.
Wow. Okay, that really is a lot going on under the surface of just talking in class. So, given all that complexity control, IRF, repair, scaffolding, all of it, how did researchers actually try to study this? How do you capture that hidden architecture?
Yeah, it's evolved quite a bit. Researchers have tried different methods to get a grip on this fast-moving stuff. Early on, back in the 60s, 70s, the main approach was interaction analysis.
Okay, what did that involve?
It's mostly quantitative, using things like coding schemes or observation checklists. Someone would sit in the back or listen to a recording and, like every 3 seconds, tick a box for what the teacher was doing or what the student was doing. Predefined categories.
So lots of counting and categorizing.
Pretty much. Think of it like trying to understand city traffic just by standing on a bridge and counting how many cars, buses, and trucks go by each minute.
You get numbers, but maybe not the full picture, like why the traffic jams happen.
Exactly. That was the criticism. It often struggled to capture the dynamic flow, the meaning behind the categories, especially from the participant's own perspective. It was often an etic view, the observer's categories imposed from outside rather than emic, trying to see it from the inside out.
Okay. So what came next?
Well, then you had discourse analysis, DA, emerging. This looked more closely at the structure and the function of language in sequences. The IRF pattern, for instance, came out of this kind of analysis, trying to see the internal logic of the conversation.
So a step closer to the why.
Definitely a step closer. But a challenge DA faced was that one single thing someone says. Well, it could have multiple possible functions depending on the context, right?
Oh, you mean?
The source uses the example of a teacher asking, "What time does this lesson begin?" Is that a genuine request for information? Or is it a subtle way of telling students off for being late?
Ah, right. Context is everything.
Exactly. And DA sometimes found it hard to fully capture that fluid, moment-by-moment, socially constructed meaning.
So if interaction analysis was counting the cars and discourse analysis was looking at the road layout and traffic signals, what looks at the drivers themselves?
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And that leads us nicely to conversation analysis, CA.
CA.
Yeah, CA actually started by studying ordinary, everyday conversation, not classrooms initially. And its focus is really micro-level. It looks at how people, as participants in talk, create social order and understanding moment by moment
How?
by examining the tiny details, turn-taking, pauses, overlaps, how sequences of talk unfold, word choice. It's intensely empirical based only on what actually happens in the recorded data, second by second. And it's strongly the goal is to understand the interaction from the perspective of the people doing it.
Okay, so CA is like watching the drivers really closely, how they signal, react to each other, slow down, speed up, and how all that creates the flow of traffic together.
That's a really good way to think about it, yeah. And while classrooms are different from casual chats, they have specific institutional goals, right? CA has proved incredibly powerful for revealing the fine-grained detail of how those goals are actually managed, negotiated, and achieved through the interaction itself.
So it shows how the context gets built by the participants in real time.
Exactly. Co-created. And the source even suggests that simply getting teachers to look at, say, untranscribed video recordings of their own lessons, maybe with some CA principles in mind, can be a really powerful reflection tool for building that CSE we talked about, seeing the details for themselves.
This is genuinely fascinating stuff. Okay, so understanding all these dynamics, the control, the IRF variations, how repair works, questioning, scaffolding, and also how we've tried to study them. What does all this actually mean for the future, like for language teaching and learning? What are the big challenges still out there?
Yeah, the source points to a few key areas moving forward. One is definitely teacher education. It argues quite strongly for needing like a dedicated third strand in teacher training programs.
A third strand, meaning?
Meaning, beyond just language knowledge and general teaching methods, teachers need explicit training focused specifically on classroom interaction, on participation, on collaboration. They need help developing their CIC, understanding these dynamics, and learning how to analyze their own practice in their own specific context.
So making interaction itself a core part of teacher training?
Exactly. Then, a related huge challenge is in actual classroom practice. Shifting away from that traditional, often very teacher-dominated interaction pattern towards more sort of equal roles, where learners feel able and are encouraged to initiate topics, to interrupt appropriately maybe, to take longer turns, to participate more like, well, genuine communicators. Because learners need to develop their own interactional competence, right? Not just receptive skills. And that really only happens when they're actively involved in co-constructing the conversation, not just answering questions.
So really empowering students to take up more of that space for learning we talked about earlier.
That's it. Okay. But managing that kind of shift, it requires really sophisticated understanding and skill from the teacher. It's not easy.
I can imagine. Anything else?
And finally, the source just touches on technology. You know, as more digital tools get used, we need to really understand how they mediate learning through interaction.
Yeah.
Is online talk different? How can we use tech to genuinely foster meaningful collaboration and talk, not just, clicking buttons?
Right. Another layer of complexity. So bringing this all back to you, our listener, why does all this matter? Well, whether you're a language learner trying to figure out those classroom dynamics, or maybe you're a teacher thinking about how to make your lessons more interactionally rich, or honestly, even if you're just someone curious about how learning actually works, understanding these hidden dynamics gives you this completely new lens. You start to see that all that talk, it isn't just background noise, it's the engine room, it's the blueprint, it's the actual site where learning is happening, or maybe not happening as much as it could be.
Absolutely. Just appreciating the absolute centrality of classroom discourse.
Yeah.
The talk, the interaction, the collaboration that's so key, really, to unlocking language learning potential. It's about understanding that incredibly complex but fundamental dance that happens every single time people try to learn together through talk.
So here's maybe a thought for you to take away from this deep dive. Think back to the last time you were in some kind of learning situation. Could be a class, could be a workshop, maybe even just a team meeting at work where someone was explaining something. Who seemed to be controlling the conversation? How were questions asked? Were they mostly display or referential? How are mistakes or disagreements handled? Gently, directly, ignored.
Yeah, great questions to ask.
And how much space did you feel there was for you or for others to really jump in, ask your own questions, shape the direction a bit. What interactional patterns might you notice now that maybe you wouldn't have before? Just listen to the conversations around you with these new ears. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.